I grew up in Central America. Panama was, and maybe still is, 99% Roman Catholic. The many churches of my childhood were a treat for all the senses. Incense was burned and waved at the steps on the street. Music filled the air. Foreheads were anointed with oil or with ash according to the season and the ceremony. The tongues of the faithful were sponged with dry communion wafers, lips wetted with wine. But it is the sights of those churches that haunt me. For the halls and altars of Hispanic America are dominated by the crucifixion, not the sanitized cross of the glorified Christ figure we more commonly see here, and certainly not the empty cross of Protestants. The churches of my childhood confronted the faithful with reminders of its legacy from the Spanish Inquisition. The churches of my childhood were covered with bloody and tortured crucifixes of a Jesus left forsaken, the foreboding image of open wounds, graphically mangled limbs, and agonized countenance. The Romans had preserved crucifixion for its most despised non-Roman criminals, traitors, pirates, criminal captives. It was deemed the most disgraceful, shameful, and painful execution they could use. It is in this setting that my high school choir director, preparing us to sing the Easter portions of Handel's Messiah, brought in an expert once to describe to us in gory detail how a person nailed to a cross might slowly and painfully succumb to this tortured death. For every breath, he claimed, a person would have to lift themselves up until they could not bear to breathe anymore. It could take days to suffocate in this way. It is an excruciating ending. Excruciating. The word means from the cross. No surprise, then, that I have struggled my whole life to make sense of the use of the cross as the primary symbol for Christianity. As a teenager, I empathized with Bertrand Russell, famous atheist author, who said he could not trust a religion that chose as its symbol an ancient torture device. And that is where my understanding, my naive childhood understanding of the cross, stayed for decades. The cross as a symbol of Christianity was not common, actually, until the 4th century, when upon his conversion, Constantine outlawed crucifixion as a form of punishment and then adopted it as a Christian symbol, not just in the gesture of the faithful, which was already common but secret at the time, but he used the cruciform shape itself as a religious object worthy in itself of veneration. It is often the cross and the theologies that stem from it that divide Unitarianism over history from mainstream Protestantism. Those theologies include the emphasis of Jesus as divine rather than human, the resurrection from the dead, the idea that Jesus or anyone could die to atone for your personal sins, the ascension to heavenly reunion instead of creating paradise on earth here as our imperative. These theologies of Easter are why Unitarians crossed the road from Christianity. They are theologies that we have actively rejected. So how can we try to deepen our understanding of the meaning this ubiquitous symbol holds for so many people across the globe? What wisdom might we glean if we are willing to hold the tension between our belief and disbelief? By trying to understand the cross as symbol, what could it hold for us? How can we empathize at all? We people of open minds, loving hearts, and helping hands.
Were you there when Jess talked about the cross? Were you there? Were you there when Jess talked about the cross? Oh, sometimes it causes me to wonder, wonder, wonder. Were you there when Jess talked about the cross? Were you there? What do you think about the cross today? Cross today. What do you think about the cross today? Oh, sometimes it causes me to wonder, wonder, wonder. What do you think about the cross today? Cross today. What can we learn by thinking of the cross? Can we learn? What can we learn by thinking of the cross? Oh, sometimes it causes me to wonder, wonder, wonder. What can we learn by thinking of the cross? Can we learn? How can you discuss a paradox? Can you use? How can
an experiment for those of you willing and able, because I'd rather show you than tell you this. You'll need some room to stand, so you'll want to fill in the aisles so you don't unintentionally whack anybody. Little exercise. Okay, so first I want you to stand like this. Tighten up, really tighten, 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 squeeze those fists. And now without whacking your neighbor, I want you to hold your arms out. And just breathe deeply and feel, what does that feel like in your body to stand this way? Now tighten up again, and again just pay attention to the difference in the feeling. And now out again. You can sit down. So, how did it feel to stand this way? What happens to you? Not surprising, a variety of answers, but a lot of experiences of kind of freedom, openness. You're certainly more vulnerable, and vulnerability is one of those tricky traits, right? It's at the one hand, it's really wonderful and freeing and open, and on the other hand, as soon as you're vulnerable, what do you want to do? It's a little fear. So while I mostly heard some positive things, I imagine those of you not raising your hand also have, in a Unitarian church, an enormous amount of discomfort when your atheist minister says, go like this. Naming it. Naming it. I'm glad I didn't chicken out, though. So, last summer, I attended a retreat with Parker Palmer, that Quaker author and activist. And he suggested to me that the cross is relevant, especially relevant to all of us today, across traditions, in this age of the politics of rage and an irresponsible media that flame discord instead of encouraging debate. An age in which the democratic process, he says, is in danger of decay. Palmer asking us to stand and contemplate the cross made me very anxious about my whole weekend I had devoted to studying with him. But I'm glad I stayed open-hearted, because his image of a modern cross, a modern understanding of the cross, has transformed an understanding that I had that was forged in those childhood images of torture that I have for all my multi-faith ecumenical spirit had been closed off to understanding. For Palmer says that the cross is a symbol of the useful holding of tension. Not either or, but both and. On the one hand and on the other hand. It is a symbol of paradox, not just the Easter paradox of life and death, but the complexity and contradictions by which we all live, and in which we stand in between. Because when you are standing like this, you are actually standing, he says, in the tragic gap. A gap between between the way things are and the way we know they might be. We stand holding the tension between harsh reality and infinite possibility. We want impossibly contradictory things. In raising our children, we want them to experience freedom, and we want to provide a framework of discipline. We ourselves want independence and liberty, and we also depend on the rule of law for communal public safety and order. We interpret our lives with past, and we are in every moment creating our very futures. While reactive fear teaches us kill or be killed, a responsive hope inclines us to tend and befriend. We are, every one of us, both light and shadow. We live as though forever, though we know we are finite. Parker says, as you stand in the gap between reality and possibility, the temptation is to jump onto one side or the other. If you jump on the side of too much hard reality, you can get stuck in corrosive cynicism. You game the system to get ahead and let the devil take the hindmost. If you jump onto the side of too much possibility, you can get caught up in irrelevant idealism. You float around in a dream state saying, wouldn't it be nice if? Those two extremes sound very different, but they have the same impact on us. Both take us out of the gap, and the gap is where all the action is. That's the gap Martin Luther King Jr. stood in his whole life. It is the gap where Nelson Mandela stood. It is the gap of Rosa Parks. It is the gap of Tommy Douglas. It is tragic, says Palmer, because it is a gap that will never close. It's an inevitable flaw of our human condition. No one who has stood for high values, love, truth, justice, has died being able to declare victory once and for all. If we embrace those values, love, truth, justice, we need to find ways to stand in the gap for the long haul and be prepared to die without having achieved our goals. Of all the tensions we must hold in personal and political life, perhaps the most fundamental and most challenging is to stand in that gap with hope. On the one side, on that hard reality of the world, those realities can crush our spirits and defeat our hopes. On the other side of the gap, in that real world possibilities, life as we know it could be that way. Because if you think about it, we have actually seen glimpses of it. We see a world at war, but we have known moments of peace. We see racial and religious enmity, but we have known moments of unity. We see suffering caused by unjust scarcities, but we have seen moments of material and spiritual sharing in which abundance was generated. Possibilities of this sort are not wishful dreams or fantasies. They are alternative realities that we have witnessed in our own lives. It is in that tragic gap that we meet differences, opinions and policies and attitudes that threaten to deeply divide us. Building tolerance to stand in the tragic gap invites relationship. It opens us to understanding. Throwing facts at one another does not change anybody's minds. But asking for a story, learning about one another's journeys. That teaches us to hold our differences to one another creatively for the sake of a more equitable, just, and compassionate world. The willingness to stand in that ambiguous, uncomfortable gap is the key to personal growth. It is the key to building community. Standing in the tragic gap is the foundational stance. It is the assumption of the democratic process. Our own humanist traditions urge us to develop intellectual habits that urge us to hold on to the tension of opposites. Humanism encourages the ability to look at an issue from all sides, to be comfortable with contradictions and ambiguities, and to honor paradox in thought, in speech, and in action. Our wisdom is increased when we engage with oppositional opinions. The tensions that reside in the tragic gap are not problems to be resolved, but are rather a paradox which we embrace and engage. And these impossible contradictions are mediated in the heart. The heart, writes Palmer, is where we integrate what we know in our minds with what we know in our bones. The heart is where we integrate the intellect with emotion, imagination, and intuition. The heart is the place where our knowledge can become more fully human. We build the capacity to hold the tension of the tragic gap in the same way we might build our muscles, by exercising it. Palmer says that the heart responds to a version of supply and demand, and so when we consent to make ourselves vulnerable more often, open more often, we increase the heart's capacity. So to exercise the heart, we must first and foremost allow our hearts to be broken. Were you with me until then? Really, Rev? Let the heart break. The art of the exercise is to let the heart be broken open, not apart. When the heart breaks, it is mended back together again with the adhesive of compassion. But the organ once broken is never the same. The mending leaves a clumsy crack. So the heart actually grows bigger. It breaks again. It mends. It leaves another crack. Packed again with compassion to fill the brokenness until the heart grows bigger and bigger and bigger still, allowing us to live and love more fully, more deeply, more openly, more freely. Compassion holds a broken heart together. And the heart can do this, can break open, not apart, when it is flexible enough to allowing ourselves to risk enough to let it break in the first place. Parker Palmer recommends that we develop 5 habits of the heart. He says we must understand we're all in this together. We must develop an appreciation of the value of otherness. We must cultivate the ability to hold tension in life-giving ways. It's not a threat. It's a gift. We must generate a sense of personal voice and agency. And we must strengthen our capacity to create community. Exercising our hearts in these ways, risking heartbreak, confronting and engaging with our own suffering, and opening ourselves to the suffering of others is a matter of life and death. Palmer says, violence is what happens when we don't know what else to do with our suffering. That applies on every level of life. When individuals don't know what to do with their suffering, they do violence to others or to themselves through substance abuse, extreme overwork, for example. When nations don't know what to do with their suffering, as with the U.S. after 9/11, they go to war. But when the human heart is open, suffering is capable of generating vitality instead of violence. Parker Palmer says there is an intimate connection between our capacity to get real and our capacity to get well. There's a Hasidic teaching that says the pupil comes to the rabbi and asks, why does the Torah tell us to place these words upon your hearts? Why does it not tell us to place these holy words in our hearts? And the rabbi answers, it is because as we are, our hearts are closed. So we cannot place the holy words in our hearts. So if we place them on top of our hearts, then they stay there until one day the heart breaks and words fall in. Let this be our practice, to stand in the tragic gap between what is and what can be, hearts open wide and ready to break. Let us stand in that tragic gap because it is relationship that lives in the gap. Humility lives in the gap. The power of story lives in the gap. Courage lives in the gap. Integration awaits in the gap. Compassion lies in the gap. May it be so.